Thank you, Secretary General. Your Excellency, Dr. William Samuel Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, and our host. And I was thinking about how to really get your try to right this morning. Congratulations on your trip to the United States, which was a wonderful state visit you had, but you came back with a new title. And it was called by President Biden, the major non-NATO ally. So you're going to start putting that behind your name, Mr. President. Thank you for welcoming us to Kenya. Your Excellency, Denis Sassou Nguesso, President of the Republic of Congo. Your Excellency, Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. Your Excellency, Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Your Excellency, Mohamed Yunus Al-Menfi, President of the Presidency Council of the Government of the National Unity of the State of Libya. Your Excellency, Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, President of the Federal Republic of Somalia. Your Excellency, Musa Faki, my dear brother, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Your Excellency, Prosper Bozum Mbaza, Vice President of the Republic of Burundi, representing His Excellency President Evariste Ndayishimiye. Your Excellency, Sarah Kungogelwa Amandila, Prime Minister of the Republic of Namibia, representing His Excellency President Nangolo Umumba. Your Excellency, Ali Lamin Zain, Prime Minister of the Republic of Niger and a former staff of the African Development Bank. Your Excellency, Alexandre Baro-Chambrier, Vice Prime Minister of the Republic of Gabon. Your Excellencies, representing heads of state and government. Your Excellency, Joachim Chissano, former President of the Republic of Mozambique. Professor Njuguna Ndungu, Cabinet Secretary of the Treasury of Kenya and Chairman of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank Group. Your Excellency, I have two friends here because you asked us to work together globally. I'm delighted to be joined here by two of my colleagues that are presidents of multilateral development banks. Your Excellency, Dr. Mohammed Sulaiman Al-Jazar, President and Chairman of the Islamic Development Bank Group, and His Excellency Jean Lukun, President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Banks. I'm joined by all my colleagues from African financial institutions and our partners, honorable heads of national institutions of the Republic of Kenya, my dear honorable governors of the African Development Bank Group, cabinet secretaries, excellencies, heads of diplomatic missions, my executive directors, my senior management and staff, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, my beautiful darling wife, Grace, my #1 supporter, counselor, and friend. Thank you. Good morning. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group. These annual meetings take on a special nature this year because it marks the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the African Development Bank Group. We are delighted that you all are able to join us on this auspicious occasion. I wish to thank His Excellency President William Ruto for accepting to host these annual meetings in this beautiful country of Kenya and the Sunshine City of Nairobi. I wish to thank you all our heads of state and government for making time to join us for this special occasion. We are truly delighted that all our shareholders are here, represented by our dear governors from all of our shareholder countries. Your collective support, advocacy, and financial commitments to the African Development Bank Group make us who we are and afford us the opportunity to serve as Africa's premier financial institution. We are inspired by the vision of our founding fathers and mindful of our position and the role within the global financial architecture, as well as the responsibility placed on us by the African Union to mobilize financing for Africa's development. We carry the hopes and the aspirations of Africa in our institutional genes and in our corporate soul. As we gather today, we do so against the backdrop of major global challenges, including heightened geopolitical tensions, the disruption of global value chains, rising food and energy prices, increasing debt service payments, and, of course, climate change. The devastating effects of climate change are everywhere, from droughts to floods, from cyclones to unpredictable weather patterns, the loss of lives and property, and enormous fiscal costs to countries. May I please kindly request that we all stand to observe a moment of silence in honor of those who lost their lives during the recent floods in Kenya and all other countries who have been devastated by the effects of the climate change they did not cause or even know about. Your Excellencies, please. Thank you very much. May their souls rest in peace. Even as we remember them, we must be resolute about taking decisive action to build more climate-resilient economies. And that's why I applaud President Ruto for hosting the landmark Africa Climate Summit right here in Kenya, where we collectively agreed to put Africa at the heart of global climate change efforts, especially climate adaptation. Your Excellencies, African economies are showing great resilience despite the challenges posed by climate change, geopolitical tensions, global inflation, and rising debt, among others. The African Development Bank projects that Africa's real GDP growth will rise from 3.1% in 2023 to 3.7% in 2024 and 4.3% in 2025. Importantly, despite these headwinds, more than half, and that is 31 countries, achieved higher real GDP growth rates in 2023 than in 2022. And most importantly, 10 African countries are among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. I think we've done well against the headwinds. I think we deserve a clap for Africa. The African Development Bank Group strongly supports African economies. In 2023, our financing totaled $10 billion across all of our high-five priorities to light up and power Africa, to feed Africa, to industrialize Africa, to integrate Africa, and to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. These high fives, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, are the accelerators of Africa's development. The bottom line is that the African Development Bank delivers. Since we launched these high fives in 2016, our financing has impacted the lives of over 400 million people. Last year, our work has significant impact across the continent, with 11 million farmers provided with access to improved agricultural technologies, 8 million people provided with access to new sanitation services, 3.5 million people with access to improved transport, 2.8 million people provided with better health services, 1 million people provided with access to clean water, and over 443,000 enterprises provided with access to finance. The African Development Bank is highly responsive. When the Russian war in Ukraine erupted, it posed tremendous food security risks to Africa. To forestall a crisis, the bank launched a $1.5 billion emergency food production facility to rapidly support African countries in their ambition to reduce food dependency over a 2-year period. As of April 2024, we have approved loans and grants of $1.496, to be precise, billion for this emergency food production in 35 countries. We also got help and support from our shareholders. $53 million of additional support from the government of Japan, the government of the United States, Norway, Germany, and the Netherlands. We have therefore fully committed $1.8 billion to 35 countries. I am pleased to report, Your Excellencies, dear governors, that we have reached 10.5 million farmers and supported the production of 26 million metric tons of food, valued at $10.79 billion, or 90% of our target market value, and we still have about 2 seasons to go. Your Excellencies, dear governors, the African Development Bank is a strategic partner of choice, trusted by countries. Right here in Kenya, when I came to see His Excellency President Ruto, he talked about our support making a huge difference at the State House. As he mentioned to me, President Ruto mentioned to me that when I visited, he says, thanks to the African Development Bank, we increased the number of households in Kenya that have access to connectivity to electricity from 2.5 million to 10 million by 2023. Thank you for that testimony, Your Excellency, Mr. President. On one of my trips to a village where the bank supported last-mile connectivity for low-income households, a lady whose name was Grace, and that's not Grace, my wife, because she's also Grace, told us about the impact of our work. When asked if she knows Dr. Adeshina as I was walking in front of her, she said no. When asked if she was aware that the African Development Bank, as President Ruto was saying, financed the project, she said no. All I know is we once were in darkness. Now we have light. Our impact is felt where it matters most, in the lives of the people we serve day and night. The African Development Bank has consistently invested in infrastructure. In the past 9 years, we have invested over $50 billion in infrastructure projects on the continent. By far the largest investment of any multilateral development bank or institution. And the impacts are visible. We are raising $3.2 billion for the East Africa Standard Gauge Railway connecting Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi. We are providing $500 million towards the development of the Lobito Corridor to link Zambia, Angola, and the DRC. We are mobilizing $375 million for financing the railway linking Nigeria to Niger Republic. We are mobilizing $3.5 billion to $5 billion towards the development of the Liberty Corridor that will link Liberia and Guinea. We have worked with our partners under the Africa Investment Forum to mobilize $15.6 billion of investment commitment towards the development of the Lagos-Abidjan corridor. Together with Africa 50, whose board I share and is a great institution, we are mobilizing $630 million for the construction of the road and rail to link the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are financing the Guasib-Nado Highway in Morocco and the 1,000-kilometer highway linking Addis Ababa to Nairobi and Mombasa, which has expanded trade flows between Ethiopia and Kenya by 400%. That's who we are, a solutions and impact-driven bank. The African Development Bank, your bank, is in very strong financial shape. We have maintained our AAA rating, the only AAA-rated financial institution in Africa, by all global credit rating agencies. The bank posted strong financial records for the year 2023. First, income from loans and treasury investments increased from $775 million in 2022 to $1.73 billion in 2023, an increase of 123%. Second, the net income before distributions at $545 million is the largest ever in the history of the African Development Bank. Third, the amount that we allocate to reserve to build our liquidity buffers, $335 million, is also the highest ever in the history of the bank. I wish to thank the executive directors of the bank and their advisors, as well as my senior management and staff at the bank for their hard work and efforts, and please join me in thanking them. Yet, as we make these efforts, we recognize that a lot more financing is needed to accelerate Africa's growth and development. The calls for reforms of the global financial architecture is necessary to mobilize even more financial resources to achieve Africa's sustainable development goals. The G20 Capital Adequacy Framework called for multilateral development banks to optimize their balance sheets, to raise more financing to support countries. The African Development Bank, Your Excellencies, our dear governors, ladies and gentlemen, heeded that call. We have been at the forefront of several financial innovations to achieve this. Last month, the African Development Bank issued a hybrid capital on the global capital market, the first ever by a multilateral development bank, creating a new global asset class for investors. These $750 million hybrid capital will be leveraged 3 to 4 times to expand the bank's lending capacity. I am delighted that 2 weeks ago, the Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, approved the use of the special drawing rights, SDRs, as hybrid capital, which is based on the proposal developed by the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. If the approved limit of $20 billion of the SDRs is channeled to multilateral development banks like us, we can leverage these to deliver at least $80 billion of new financial support. I would like to use this time to thank you, our heads of states and government, for the advocacy that you have maintained on this particular issue at every single step, and also for the chairman of the African Union Commission, my dear brother Musa Faki, for all of the advocacy that you have also maintained, and for all of our governors for supporting us in this particular area. We are very grateful. Thank you very, very much. Now, I wish to ask for the support of all of our shareholders to make this a reality. Your Excellencies, dear governors, ladies and gentlemen, to tackle climate change, the African Development Bank is well on its way to reaching our goal of mobilizing $25 billion in climate finance. Last year, we devoted 45% of our total lending to climate finance. Our climate action window, under 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund, with support from the governments of the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, opened its first call for proposals. The response was amazing. It received over 2,000 proposals, and the 359 shortlisted application requests were close to $4 billion. The bank, your bank, is building strong and effective global partnerships to deliver more for Africa. Through the support of the G7, we are accelerating women's access to finance through what we call the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, or AFAWA, with 169 financial institutions in 43 countries. And I would like to say that Africa will go faster when we make sure that it flies with 2 wings. No bird flies with 1 wing. When we support our women, they actually run most of our economies. I think Africa will go faster, more inclusively. AFAWA, Your Excellencies, 30,000 women-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. Your Excellencies, they are governors to support youth entrepreneurship in Africa and to create youth-based wealth. The bank has established youth entrepreneurship investment banks in partnership with the French development agency, Agence Française de Développement, and other partners with support from the bank's multi-donor Youth Entrepreneurship Trust Fund. Ever since our board approved the first two Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks in Liberia with $16 million of funding, and Ethiopia recently with $12 million of funding, several countries, including Nigeria, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Tunisia, Togo, Egypt, South Africa, Zambia, Botswana, DRC, are working on submissions of their request. Your Excellencies, the bank is working with several partners to ramp up support for digital and creative sectors to create more jobs. Together with Islamic Development Bank, and my brother Al-Jazair is here, and the Agence Française de Développement, we financed $618 million IDICE program called Initiative for the Development of Digital and Creative Enterprises in Nigeria that will create 6 million jobs and add $6.4 billion to the economy. The African Development Bank, Africa 50, and the African Union established what's called the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, or AGIA, which will mobilize $10 billion for green infrastructure in Africa and speed up Africa's green transitions. I am delighted that at the G7 Ministerial Conference in Italy just a few days ago, they gave global endorsement for AGIA. Together with the Islamic Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the OPEC Fund, the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, the Africa Export and Import Bank, and the West African Development Bank, we are establishing what's called special agro-industrial processing zones in 11 African countries, including a $3 billion facility by the African Development Bank, Afri-Exim Bank, and the ARISE platform. Your Excellencies, they ask us to work together as multilateral development banks, and we are doing that. At the spring meetings of the World Bank Group, President Ajay Banga and I launched a joint bold effort to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030. We will host this year, together with Your Excellencies, an Africa Energy Summit later this year. I must say, this marks the first time for our institution. So not only are we reforming, but we are also changing how we work together as a system to deliver greater impacts at scale. That's because together we can and we will achieve more. Your Excellencies, for generations, women in Africa have borne the brunt of risks and hardships associated with cooking. Nothing could be more important than ensuring 1.2 billion people, majority of whom are women across Africa, have access to clean cooking solutions. I didn't start using glasses because I went to university and got smart. I started using glasses because as a kid, I was blowing charcoal into the cooking stoves of my mother. And when she bought a cooker for which we can turn on the gas, it was blue, I had to invite my friends to come and see it. In fact, I was turning it on because of the smell, because it was so different from the kind of smell that I used to have. So when we are talking about energy transitions, that is the kind of transition some of us have gone through. And therefore, I believe no woman and no child should ever have to die from the risk associated with smoke inhalation and other hazards, because today we lose 300,000 women for trying to cook a decent meal. Another 300,000 of their kids dying for trying to cook a decent meal. Enough is enough. It's not just about lighting a stove, it's about life itself. It is about dignity for women, and it's about protecting the environment from massive deforestation and a reliance on biofuel, biomass, firewood, and charcoal. And that's why I was honored and privileged to co-chair the Clean Cooking in Africa Summit with Her Excellency Suluhu Hassan, Samia Suluhu Hassan, the President of the Republic of Tanzania, who did a marvelous job, His Excellency Jonas Thor, the Prime Minister of Norway, and Dr. Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. The African Development Bank led the way by committing to provide $2 billion towards clean cooking solutions for women over the next 10 years. I am delighted that the summit in Paris raised an additional $2.1 billion in commitments, bringing the total commitments to clean cooking to $4.1 billion, a historic achievement and a testament to the power of partnerships. Thank you very much. I thank you, all our shareholders across all 81 member countries, for providing us the support and the resources we need to serve Africa better. With your continued support, we will drive a bolder, bigger, and better agenda for Africa. I thank you, our partners, for joining your hands with ours as we deliver more together for Africa and as we have done for the last 60 years. I thank you, our dear heads of states, your excellencies, heads of state and government, as you lead and as you show passion and commitment to the African Development Bank Group, to our continent, and for your generosity towards our efforts with you in your countries. I thank you, our boards of directors, for always mobilizing support for us in your countries and for relentless efforts you make to back our innovations and initiatives. I thank you, our boards of directors, for your strong oversight and support. And I thank you, my staff and colleagues, for being the best staff one could ever hope for. When I was recently interviewed, I was asked, what will I miss the most at the end of my 10-year term next year? I didn't have to think far. I said, my staff. So I'd like my staff to please stand, all my staff to stand. And let's continue to make Africa proud. Thank you all. God bless you all. Asante sana.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands once more together for the President of the African Development Bank. I'm sure by now you will agree with me with how I started by saying an evangelist. Now I can add the passionate evangelist for Africa's development. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to call upon His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, to deliver his statement.
Your Excellency, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, Your Excellencies, Head of State, Government and Delegations, Excellencies, former Head of State, Honorable Ministers, Dr. Akim Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, distinguished representatives of African multilateral financial institutions, distinguished representatives of the diplomatic corps and development partners, ladies and gentlemen. It is with real pleasure that I address this August Assembly gathered here for the annual meetings of the African Development Bank. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to President William Ruto, the government and the people of Kenya for the brotherly and warm welcome accorded to me in this beautiful and the large city of Nairobi, which has warmly accustomed me to it every time I return. Indeed, Nairobi has forged a formidable reputation as a premier hosting place for conferences at which key issues concerning the future of our continent are discussed. The African Union is grateful to you. I also wish to express my thanks to the President of the African Development Bank, my brother and friend, Dr. Akim Adesina, whose passionate commitment to Africa's development, present and the future, has never wavered. Mr. President, thank you for your invitation to the African Union to this important meeting. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, cette rencontre se tient dans un contexte marqué par un enchevêtrement de crises géopolitiques et économiques, aggravé par ailleurs par les effets de la pandémie de la COVID-19, dont la rémanence est loin d'avoir encouragé la stabilité sociale et politique de nos États membres, en dépit d'une résilience africaine à la catastrophe mondiale. Pour y faire face, tous nos États membres ont qui les maintient sous le joug des créanciers aux exigences étouffantes malgré les nombreuses promesses d'allègement de ce fardeau. Ces recours, parfois excessifs à l'endettement, bien qu'ils puissent être expliqués par un ensemble de facteurs endogènes, est également imputable à un modèle de financement extérieur combinant l'aide au développement, l'allègement du fardeau de la dette, les promesses du financement vert et l'attractivité des États africains pour les IDE. Ce modèle, explicité dans la déclaration d'Addis Ababa sur le financement du développement de 2015, a été par la suite relayé par des rencontres similaires à l'instar de celle de Paris de 2021. Les limites de ce modèle ont été établies sur la base de données objectives. J'aurais pu les ressasser, surtout devant les professionnels que vous êtes. Je me limiterai à une ou deux brèves remarques qui me paraissent dignes d'être mentionnées. En effet, les apports de financements extérieurs dans la gestion du développement de l'Afrique ont été très loin des attentes, traduisant ainsi une injustice, encore une autre, à l'égard de l'Afrique. Cette injustice cumule plusieurs visages. Bien qu'elle ne soit pas responsable du réchauffement climatique, l'Afrique en subit des conséquences sans bénéficier de la solidarité financière consacrée dans les déclarations successives des différentes conférences des parties. La gestion du système financier international, en échappant totalement au contrôle de l'Afrique, lui impose des coûts de financement élevés, en même temps que l'impact négatif des crises financières. Des disparités dans la réponse au choc de la COVID-19 ont clairement indiqué que l'augmentation de la liquidité par la création des droits de tirage spéciaux n'a pas profité de façon significative à l'Afrique, qui n'en a reçu que la portion congrue de 5,1% pour 1,4 milliard d'habitants. Alors que la recherche des moyens pour combler les déficits financiers de l'Afrique s'est toujours opérée dans le cadre de cette architecture financière internationale dont les limites font aujourd'hui consensus au sein de la communauté des experts africains, voire au-delà. Le temps est venu de s'interroger concrètement sur l'identification non complaisante des différents ressorts qui handicapent la mobilisation d'un développement de l'Afrique. C'est donc à point nommé que se tiennent ces assises, dont la tonalité innovatrice du thème « Réformer l'architecture financière mondiale afin de libérer des financements pour l'Afrique » annonce une large réflexion, embrassant dans la profondeur de son mouvement les principaux enjeux liés au financement du développement du continent. Dans cette mouvance, la centralité du rôle du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement n'échappe à personne. C'est donc une belle occasion pour le groupe de faire le point de ses réalisations au cours des dernières années afin de tracer une trajectoire viable pour le financement durable de nos économies confrontées à des goulots et contraintes multiformes. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, il m'apparaît plus qu'urgent de travailler à une réforme profonde de la gouvernance internationale afin de proposer et d'adopter des solutions pertinentes pour les pays confrontés aux problèmes de notation souveraine, de l'endettement excessif, des effets des changements climatiques, de l'évasion fiscale et des flux illicites, du renforcement des banques multilatérales, et j'en passe. Pour défendre l'intérêt de l'Afrique dans ces domaines, il me paraît logique d'inviter toutes les institutions financières africaines, ici présentes et même celles qui sont absentes, à accompagner l'Union africaine dans ces mouvements de basculement des équilibres économiques et financiers mondiaux. Aussi voudrais-je me réjouir de la récente adhésion de l'Union africaine comme membre permanent du G20. Cette adhésion marque un tournant décisif et porte un nouvel espoir pour l'Afrique, celui de s'impliquer dans la dynamique du processus de la réforme de la gouvernance économique et financière mondiale. Le G20 est un forum approprié pour nos institutions et nos pays pour initier efficacement, ensemble, le processus de formulation des positions africaines communes sur les questions stratégiques au cœur de la réforme du système financier mondial. Je pense notamment à l'épineuse question de la réforme des institutions de Bretton Woods, la réforme des mécanismes de gestion de la dette, du financement du changement climatique et du système fiscal international, notamment au regard des développements en cours en vue de l'adoption d'une convention cadre des Nations Unies sur la coopération fiscale internationale. Pour nous préparer à une éventuelle reconfiguration de l'architecture financière internationale, il nous revient d'accomplir, sans retard, nos propres réformes monétaires et financières. La mise en œuvre des institutions financières de l'Union africaine, créée depuis longtemps, plus de 20 ans, a trop souffert de son report. La Banque centrale africaine, la Banque africaine d'investissement, les fonds monétaires africains ainsi que la Bourse panafricaine des valeurs mobilières, c'est maintenant qu'il faut en adopter le plan concret des mises sur les rails. Aussi, j'en appelle à une reconstitution ambitieuse des ressources du Fonds africain de développement. C'est un instrument offrant des financements concessionnels indispensables pour le financement de nos économies. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, au cours des dernières années, le bilan de la Banque africaine de développement a attesté de sa ferme volonté d'accompagner l'Afrique dans la recherche des réponses à ces problèmes. À ce titre, à travers ces 5 priorités stratégiques, les High Fives, elle a placé sur les rails la transformation structurelle des économies, posant les jalons de l'industrialisation et améliorant l'accès à l'électricité, à l'alimentation et aux infrastructures socio-économiques essentielles, autant de facteurs de consolidation de la productivité. En améliorant les conditions favorables à l'innovation et à la recherche dans les domaines clés de l'agriculture, de l'industrie et des services en vue de faciliter l'accès des économies nationales aux chaînes de valeur régionales et mondiales, la BAD a joué et continue de jouer un rôle majeur dans la facilitation du commerce et dans l'intégration intrarégionale et mondiale de telles économies. Dans ces sillages, j'encourage vivement la Banque à intensifier son soutien à la zone de libre-échange continentale, à l'industrialisation de l'Afrique afin de réduire sa vulnérabilité aux chocs exogènes, à poursuivre ses investissements dans les secteurs clés de la santé, de l'éducation, de l'innovation, de l'énergie, de l'agriculture, de la sécurité alimentaire et des infrastructures durables, gage d'une transformation socio-économique certaine. Pour sa part, la Commission de l'Union africaine s'est résolument inscrite dans un esprit de positive collaboration avec la BAD. Dans cette collaboration va se matérialiser, entre autres, par l'élaboration d'un cadre stratégique continental conçu aux fins d'accompagner les États membres dans la mise en œuvre d'actions concrètes orientées vers une nette amélioration de la croissance dans les années à venir. La Commission a également apporté son plein soutien à l'initiative conjointe de la Banque africaine de développement et de la Banque interaméricaine de développement, visant l'accès aux capitaux hybrides déployés à partir de la mobilisation des DTS. Une telle mobilisation, équivalente à une source de financement complémentaire, réduira la dépendance aux emprunts traditionnels et potentiellement les coûts de financement. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je m'en voudrais au regard d'un bilan aussi reluisant et face à l'engagement personnel du président de la BAD, ancré par ailleurs dans une vision prospective pertinente, de ne pas adresser au nom de la Commission de l'Union africaine et au mien propre des félicitations bien méritées à mon frère et ami le docteur Adesina, évangéliste en chef, peut-être mieux. J'entretiens également l'inébranlable conviction que les archives de la Banque continueront de parler de son adhésion quasi fusionnelle au développement de notre continent, aux Africains et Africaines des générations futures. Avec cette pensée aux générations futures, je vous souhaite de fructueuses délibérations, plein succès à vos assises et vous remercie de votre bienveillante attention.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the chairperson of the African Union. President of the Republic of Kenya to deliver his opening address.
Thank you very much. Please take your seats. Your Excellency, Denis Sassou Nguesso, President of the Republic of Congo. Your Excellency, Emerson Mnangagwa, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Your Excellency, Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. Your Excellency, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, President of the Republic of Somalia. Your Excellency, Mohammed Yunus Memfi, President of the Presidential Council of Libya. Your Excellency, Mohammed Musa Faki Mahamat, Chair of the Africa Union Commission. Your Excellency, Evangelist Akiwumi Adesina, President of the Africa Development Bank. Your Excellency, former President Joaquim Chissano of Mozambique, Your Excellencies, Vice Presidents, Prime Ministers, representatives of heads of state, Your Excellency, Governor of Nairobi, Johnson Sakaja, Madam Martha Koome, Chief Justice and President of the Supreme Court of the Republic of Kenya, Excellencies, Ministers, Honorable Governors, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted and privileged to preside over the opening session of the 59th Annual Summit of the Africa Development Bank Group. On behalf of the people and government of Kenya, I extend a very warm welcome to each of you and invite you to feel at home in this land of many delights. It is a great honor for Kenya to host the 59th meeting of the Africa Development Bank Group, especially as the group celebrates its 60th anniversary. Let me put this in context. We had also the privilege to host the 30th anniversary of the Africa Development Group in 1994. We are privileged to host the 60th. And I have requested to offer Kenya the 90th anniversary in 2054. And I promise that even if I would be walking with a walking stick, I will attend. This milestone should frame our deliberations and engagements during these meetings. We are gathered here to reflect on the progress of our continent that has made in realizing the founding vision of this institution, the Africa Development Bank. Formed in the first decade following the independence of most African countries, the Africa Development Bank embodies the Pan-African ideology of sovereignty, prosperity, and unity. As a matter of fact, one of the founding communiques of this institution clearly declares the determination of African nations to use all our resources to lead all African countries to independence and achieve the development and prosperity of the continent in unity. That was done 60 years ago. And over 6 decades, the group, like the continent, has not only survived many crises and challenges, but has also grown stronger and achieved much in supporting economic growth and stability in our continent. It has become Africa's premier development financing institution. To date, it has financed 5,432 projects across our land, 4,036 of them which have been completed, provided a mechanism to coordinate the fight against poverty, improve the standards of African financial institutions and other institutions, and contributed significantly to conflict prevention and resolution. You agree with me, ladies and gentlemen, that Africa Development's performance has been nothing short of sterling. I think they deserve a better round of applause. Nevertheless, the pace of African economic growth and development has not kept pace with the rest of the world. More concerning is that the pace of African development remains far behind its undeniable potential. Intra-African trade remains low, with its share of global GDP less than 3%. Africa's share of global trade is also low, at just about 2%, and our exports are primarily unprocessed produce and raw materials. Not surprisingly, the rates of poverty and unemployment are still high on our continent. The vulnerabilities arising from this situation undoubtedly contribute significantly to conflict, economic refugees, and in this age of frequent extreme climate shocks, climate refugees. There is tremendous urgency in developing and implementing transformative interventions to turn things around for our continent, our countries, and our people. I am confident that this sense of urgency resonates very strongly amongst African leaders, and I am encouraged that we are not just doing something about it. We are actually making very good progress. Our continent is growing at the world's fastest rate, exceeding the global average of 3%, and 11 of the world's fastest growing economies in 2023 were African countries. We were told that by Adesina. Between 2000 and 2002, Africa's real GDP increased at an annual rate of 4.3%, well above the global average of 2.9%. 7 of the 10 world's fastest growing economies were in this continent of Africa. Although much remains to be accomplished, with this optimism, we are also and its effect, disruption. Huge national debts caused in part by signals our collective intent to undertake radical transformation of African economies, achieve sustainable development goals, and unite our people in prosperity. We have what it takes to succeed, and current activities show movement in an encouraging direction. To achieve this transformation, a consistent commitment of substantial resources is required to invest in infrastructure, industrial capacity to deliver rapid growth. However, we face the rigid barrier of global financial architecture that is fundamentally misaligned with our aspirations. We routinely borrow from international markets at rates far above those paid by the rest of the world, often up to 8 or 10 times more. These rates are said to factor in something arbitrary called risk profile that is notably not applied when considering mineral extraction even in areas of active conflict. It is safe, we are told, to mine in spaces where there is conflict, but it is risky to lend to African economies. What a contradiction. The debt problem faced by many countries, which consume the largest share of national resources and starve development agenda, we are a direct result of this unjust financial architecture. This situation not only makes debt unsustainable, but also undermines growth, prevents countries from investing in resilience, and denies millions of people, especially young men and women, their fair shot at life's opportunities. Africa remains most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, as evidenced by recent devastating floods, for example, in Kenya, and drought in Southern Africa, from which we are still working to recover, as well as other climate-related disasters across the continent. The adverse impact of climate change or the fiscal sustainability of many economies, especially in developing countries in Africa, deserves our serious attention. Despite contributing only 4% of global carbon emissions, we bear the brunt of climate change effects. Climate change is a threat multiplier. Its direct impact and related responses negatively affect our fiscal position through reduced revenues and increased public spending. The frequency of extreme weather events continuously diminish the resources available for public investment and provision of critical public goods, such as health, education, and other social services. In particular, climate change has often resulted in substantial reallocation of resources towards mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. This is why Africa advocates for a financial architecture that integrates the issues on climate change and public finance at the center. I am proud of African heads of state who have not hesitated to make their voices heard in various fora, including through the Africa Leaders Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and Call to Action that we held here in Nairobi. Climate change and sovereign debt are now firmly integrated, trapping governments in a vicious cycle where increasing losses and damage from climate impacts leads to rising costs of mobilizing resources for public investment. With such high financing costs and constrained government budgets, developing countries continue to struggle investing in low carbon and climate resilient development. At risk, therefore, are both climate action and our sustainable development goals. A better, more responsive, and fairer international financial architecture is urgently needed, and time here is of the essence. The financial architecture we advocate for as Africa today should integrate the continent's most challenging development issues of debt sustainability and climate vulnerability to enable development goals, SDGs, and Agenda 2063 commitments to be achieved. I am encouraged by Africa Development Bank's vision for the continent, underpinned by the high fives strategies and the objectives of the newly adopted 2024-2033 10-year strategy, which provide important foundations for these critical continental objectives. Let me agree with my brother, President Adesina, on the array of investments that he has spoken to this morning. Kenya is among the beneficiaries in a very big way of Africa Development Bank's financial might and their innovative financing of projects. Let me give you just 3 examples. Africa Development Bank became the first institution for us to build the first superhighway from Nairobi through Thika, and today they are dueling the same road all the way to Maroa, about 150 kilometers. Africa Development Bank worked with us to provide water and sanitation in 28 towns and cities in Kenya that today all of them are complete. And Africa Development Bank is building with us the largest water dam in Kenya in a place called Thwake. And of course, Africa Development Bank did what Adesina said. Last 10 years, working with Africa Development Bank, other multilateral banks, and friends, they have enabled Kenya to increase electricity connectivity from 27% in the last 10 years to 76% today. We have been clear and consistent in our advocacy. Africa is neither seeking handouts nor asking for charity. We are a continent of sovereign people who aspire to grow in a just multilateral system and access development financing on fair terms. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not too much to ask. We were clear at the Africa Climate Summit last year when we called for reforms of the international financial institutions and a range of new global taxes to fund climate action. We were clear at COP28 in Dubai last December when we once again emphasized the urgent need to mobilize investment for climate transition in developing countries from public and private sources globally. We also agreed to support the creation of markets that can mobilize resources at scale and called for the reform of the international financial architecture. Today, we assert that I take this opportunity $25 billion to increase its capacity. In our continent's premier development financial by the Africa Union's Assembly of Heads of State and Government. And because we must believe in ourselves for others to believe in us, and we must invest in these institutions for others to invest in them, Kenya has made the decision that over the next 3 years, we are going to invest $100 million in enhancing our shareholding in Africa Development Bank, Afri-Exim Bank, and Trade Development Bank. We have already made the investment in Afri-Exim Bank. I will be discussing with my brother at the
I'm done with the drama.
Is Dove better than ordinary soap? We're going to prove it.
If you don't mind, please keep standing, and let's give one more big round of applause to the President. You may be seated. Now there's a challenge between President Ruto and President Adesina as to who is more passionate evangelist. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, with that strong and inspiring address, we have come to the end of the opening ceremony, and we will now transition to the presidential dialogue, Africa's Transformation, the African Development Bank Group.
Very much. Welcome to this presidential dialogue on Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture here at the annual meetings of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank, holding at the KICC, Kenyatta International Conference Center, in the beautiful, and I must say green, capital city of Nairobi. My name is Victor Oladokun. Yes, you can clap for Nairobi and certainly for Kenya. Kenya is green and has had a long history of being so. My name is Victor Oladokun, and it really is an honor to moderate the two presidential dialogues that are ahead of us this morning. Our conversations will revolve around what must be done in a fast-changing, dynamic global environment to kickstart and transform Africa's economies, as well as ensuring that they do remain sustainable. But first, permit me to invite to the podium a global leader who has a reputation, actually two reputations. One for not believing in the word impossible, and two, for being dubbed Africa's optimist-in-chief, a very well-deserved tag. Not because he is unaware of the continent's many challenges, but because he strongly believes that under any circumstances, change is possible. Please join me in welcoming to the podium once again the President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as he comes forward to provide opening remarks.
Your Excellencies, heads of state and government, their governors, I wish to thank you immensely for attending these 2024 annual meetings, and in particular for being here for this particular session, which is a debate or conversation with you heads of state and government about the issues of the transformation or the reforms of the global financial architecture, the African Development Bank, and of course, Africa's transformation. This is one topic that I know is close to your heart, as you all have been advocating for the reform of global financial architecture, the reforms of the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council, and we just heard from His Excellency President Ruto all about that. And why is that being done, or why is that necessary? That's to ensure that Africa's voice is heard, that Africa's priorities are in fact prioritized, that Africa's financial needs are appropriately considered, that there is equity, fairness, and justice in dealing with the most pressing challenge of our time, climate change. Clearly, the global financial architecture has a great role to play in mobilizing resources for development. Yet, it is not delivering enough for Africa in 5 ways. First, it is under-delivering on climate finance for Africa. Today, while Africa's climate finance needs are in the order of $277 billion annually, the global financial architecture delivers only $30 billion for Africa, a continent that contributes the least to climate change and which suffers disproportionately from its negative effects, as we have seen in several countries. Second, the global financial system is not delivering financing at scale needed for accelerated development to meet the SDGs. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has noted that the financing need now has moved from $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion annually. Africa alone will need $1.3 trillion. With SDGs, of course, due to lack of adequate financing, Africa will not be able to meet SDGs by 2030 under the current trajectory. Third, the COVID-19 pandemic showed the huge divergences in financing capacities to deal with global pandemics and its effects between developed countries and developing countries. While developed countries provided over $19 trillion to support their economies during this crisis, pandemic, equivalent to roughly 18% of the global GDP, African countries provided only $83 billion, or 3% of their GDP. No wonder there is economic divergences between Africa and developed countries and even emerging market economies, because we hear something about COVID, that people have long COVID. But now also in terms of fiscal space for African countries, it's a long COVID in terms of fiscal space because it takes a long time to be able to recover from such pandemics like that. Fourth, the global contingent financing facilities have not been fair and equitable. Take the case of the special drawing rights, as President Ruto has mentioned. Out of the $650 billion of Asia allocation, Africa got $33 billion, which is roughly 4.5%. In other words, those that needed it the most got the least. However, I want to really thank the IMF. I want to thank my sister, Kristalina Georgieva, and all our team at IMF, and of course the IMF board, for recently approving the use of SDRs as hybrid capital, which of course multilateral development banks like us can leverage 3 to 4 times and deliver greater impact based on the model that the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have developed. We're very grateful for that support. I also like to commend the IMF for providing a third seat for Africa at the board of IMF, as the chairman person of the African Union Commission mentioned the importance of having more space around the table for Africa, and we're grateful for that as well. The admission of African Union to G20 is also a commendable development, long overdue. Fifth, the global financial architecture is failing in dealing with the high rising debt burdens of African countries. While the G20 Common Framework is working to address these challenges, and we support it, to achieve equal and comparative treatment between official creditors, private creditors, and commercial lenders, the process, however, is taking way too long. Unfortunately, we shouldn't forget that Africa went through things like that in the 90s. The Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, also the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, that just dragged on, and unfortunately, we had a lost decade because of that. There's therefore a need for speedier, comprehensive resolution of debt burdens of countries. It's hard to run up a hill with a backpack of sand behind one's back. So while globally the Debt Service Suspension Initiative helped to defer due debt service payments, it only postponed it. It did not solve the problem. There is need for more timely, comprehensive debt treatment, debt restructuring, and debt resolution for African countries. And finally, Your Excellencies, the rules of global taxation, as President Ruto rightly mentioned, need to be modified to ensure that they are serving developing countries. Cooperation across jurisdictional tax rules is needed to avoid Africa losing taxes to multinational corporations that do illicit capital flows. And sometimes I hear a lot about illicit capital flows. It's not just African countries. In fact, quite a lot of multinational corporations have more lawyers, they have more accountants, they have more people than the whole country has. And therefore, we have to make sure that the whole issue of profits, tax avoidance, and profit-based shifting is addressed. In my view, if you do business in Africa, you should pay taxes in Africa. Your Excellencies, we look forward to hearing your views and perspectives, especially what the African Development Bank and all of us can do in the reforms of the global financial architecture. I'm particularly delighted that my dear brother and friend and colleague, His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Al-Jazar, President and Chairman of the Islamic Development Bank Group, is here with us today at our annual meetings, and he will also be sharing with you some thoughts ahead of your conversation. Once again, thank you, Your Excellencies, for your participation. It's a great honor for us to have you. Thank you very much.
Just as Dr. Adeshina mentioned a few moments ago, we'd like to use this opportunity to welcome to the podium a friend of Africa and a friend of the African Development Bank, His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Al-Jazar, President of the Islamic Development Bank, to give his keynote address.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Excellency, President William Ruto, the President of the Republic of Kenya. Your Excellencies, Heads of State, Your Excellency, my dear brother and friend, Dr. Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, the honorable heads of international and regional institutions, honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor to be part of this special gathering to celebrate the African Development Bank Group's 60 years of remarkable contributions to Africa's development journey. I am delighted to address such a distinguished audience today to share my thoughts on Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. Let me also take this opportunity to highlight the exceptional value we at the Islamic Development Bank place on our strategic partnership with the African Development Bank Group. It is a commitment to a shared dream of transforming the African continent and helping it deliver on its hopes and aspirations. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa, a continent full of promise and endowed with abundant resources. Africa, a continent that holds the dreams and aspirations of hundreds of millions of its people. Africa, a continent full of potential, yet grappling with critical challenges on its road to structural transformation. Since the turn of the century, many African countries have exhibited strong economic growth. A significant portion of this growth is the result of better macroeconomic management, higher investment and trade, larger regional markets, and to a lesser extent, some degree of structural transformation. Despite this progress, the core components of human development, including income levels and formal employment, remain low and vulnerable to shocks. This leads me to the key question that the region and its governments need to tackle in the coming years. What will it take to ensure that this higher growth is sustainable and inclusive? To foster and sustain development gains, economic growth alone is insufficient. African countries need to deepen their structural transformation to ensure a prosperous and secure future for all Africans. The priority will be on transforming natural resource-driven economies into knowledge-driven ones, while taking advantage of the region's demographic dividend. Reforms ought to focus on fostering a more conducive business environment to enhance competitiveness and encourage initiatives that take advantage of regional growth opportunities. In this regard, the African Continental Free Trade Area offers a huge potential for building regional supply chains, developing intra-African production networks in manufactured goods, and enhancing competitiveness. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa is on the ascent, and I am optimistic about its development prospects. However, recent estimates suggest that Africa will require an additional $200 billion annually to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Moreover, it is becoming increasingly evident that the current global financial system will not be able to provide the necessary support to achieve the ambitious transformative agenda of Africa. It is thus not surprising that there are calls for a rethink of this framework to make it more efficient and just, giving a greater voice to the global South. Additionally, significant resources are being diverted to debt servicing at the expense of critical investments in health and education. This situation clearly demands urgent reform. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 5 decades, the Islamic Development Bank Group has remained steadfast in its commitment to Africa's socio-economic development. By the end of 2023, our financing to Africa totaled approximately $74 billion, including $45 billion specifically dedicated to enhancing trade. Our efforts have been significantly strengthened through long-standing cooperation with development partners, including the African Development Bank. Between 2017 and 2023, we achieved the record co-financing volume of $2.9 billion with the African Development Bank, enabling us to co-finance 22 operations across diverse sectors, and some of them have been mentioned by my brother, Mr. Adesina. I am pleased to announce that during the Islamic Development Bank's Golden Jubilee celebrations in Riyadh last month, we further enhanced our partnership with the African Development Bank by expanding its scope and setting a higher co-financing target over the next 5 years. In this quest, where collaboration is paramount for success, the role of the Arab Coordination Group, or the ACG, in fostering development and progress across the African continent cannot be underestimated. To this end, the ACG has been a long-standing supporter of African countries and has cumulatively invested over $220 billion in the region to date. Bolstering its support for African partner countries, in November 2023, the ACG pledged a $50 billion financing envelope over the next 7 years to help build resilient infrastructure and inclusive societies in the African continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we share common dreams for Africa, a continent free of poverty where no one is left behind, a continent of hope and prosperity driven by innovation and entrepreneurship, a continent providing meaningful employment opportunities for its youth. We remain steadfast in our commitment to work with our development partners to rekindle hope, to realize Africa's dreams of transformation, especially when we recall the wise words of our host, His Excellency President Ruto, and I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, who said recently, only very recently, that Africa is neither facing east or west, but is facing forward. I wish you all successful deliberations throughout the remainder of this dialogue. I look forward to positive impact these discussions will have on shaping our strategies and actions to mobilize affordable financing for Africa's inclusive growth and structural transformation. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Many thanks, Dr. Al-Jazeer, for your keynote address and for framing many of the issues which will surround much of the presidential dialogues that have been convened this afternoon, or this morning and afternoon. At this point, I would like to invite members of the first presidential dialogue panel to take their seats on the platform. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Her Excellency Mrs. Sarah Kugon Gelwa Amadila, Prime Minister of the Republic of Namibia, representing His Excellency Mr. Nangolo Mbumba, President of the Republic of Namibia. His Excellency Mr. Mohamed Yunus El Menfi, President of the Presidential Council of the State of Libya. His Excellency Mr. Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. And last but certainly not the least, His Excellency Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya. Thank you, Excellencies, for joining us on this panel. Just a few rules here. One, because we are running behind time by probably almost 50 minutes. Each one of you will have about 3 minutes to respond to each of the questions that are posed to you. But I'd like to kickstart this dialogue, first of all, with a question for President Ruto. Just last week, you took America by storm. You were the talk of the town for a considerable amount of time in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C., the first African leader to go on a state visit to Washington, D.C. in 50 years. From all indications, a very, very successful mission, and we say congratulations to you and to Kenya. Now, for quite a while, you've been a very vocal advocate for reforming the global financial architecture, and we've heard much from you today. You've pretty much given us a tour de force of what Africa needs and what Africa needs to do. Now, considering that change is usually slow and not as quick as we anticipate it or want it to be, in terms of priorities in the short term, what do you think Africa should focus on, and what should be the major priorities moving forward?
Thank you very much. And again, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of us to Nairobi and Kenya. It is said that half the solution to a problem is identifying that there exists a problem. For a very long time, many people did not admit that there was something fundamentally wrong with the international financial architecture. In fact, initially, when voices were raised, they were dismissed. But I want to say today we are very proud, those of us, especially from this continent, who raised our voices, that today the conversation in the world is no longer whether we have a fit-for-purpose international financial architecture. Everybody admits that there is something fundamentally wrong with it. The issue in conversation now is where, how do we reform it? So the issue of reform is settled. It must be done. And I think it begins with, once we understand the problem, then it begins with where do we start? I think what we are saying is we need a financial architecture that has the following characteristics. Number one, long-term financing. 40 years, grace period, 10 years, or something in that order. Number two, low interest rates, concessional financing, including, where possible, grants. Number three, we also need financing at scale. The quantum is very important. And then number four, we also need financing that is agile, that is flexible, especially that responds, that is climate sensitive, so that if there are shocks, that financial architecture must be responsive, because climate change is the new normal. Switching from drought to floods progressively is becoming what it is. In Kenya, we had drought a year ago that decimated 2.5 million heads of livestock. This year, we're in floods that has taken the lives of 200 Kenyans. So this is the new reality. So the financial architecture that must be in place must respond to this climate reality that we have. And finally, is to be sensitive to sustainability. So our priority is to sort out the financial architecture. That's number one. Number two, our priority is to make sure that this continent, with its tremendous potential, we move it from potential to opportunity, from opportunity to investment. And finally, as I have said, even as we try to do something outside, we must also do something inside. That is why we are also looking at our own systems, our own governance, our own instruments. And that's why we are discussing, even internally, reform of the Africa Union, so that we are aligned as we reform the international financial architecture, as we reform the investment space to create opportunity for our assets. We must also reform our own institutions so that we align them and repurpose them to be in line with our aspirations and the outcomes we are looking for.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. In other words, reform is a two-way street. It's not just one way. But allow me to follow up very quickly. As we all know, Kenya and a number of other countries have been buffeted very devastatingly by extreme weather conditions, unpredictable weather conditions. And I think the projections for Kenya and other countries in the region are that over the next 7 years, we're still likely to see the same kind of weather patterns that we've seen this year. That being the case, and again, following a two-way reform process, what is it that African countries should be doing right now to mitigate the effects of climate change?
It is true that predictions are that Kenya and our region is going to have above normal rains for the next 7 years. That's a prediction. It is both positive and negative. And that is why, working with institutions like the Africa Development Bank, we are developing resilience instruments. It is the reason why we are having a conversation with the Africa Development Bank on our water infrastructure. How do we take care of this excess water? And how do we turn this excess water into an asset for making sure that we use it for our food security, we use it for the positive elements. So we must align our programs, our strategies with the reality of the moment and with the predicted reality of the future. So that is the alignment that we must do.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. I'm going to come to President Kagame next on a number of issues, particularly with regards to the global financial architecture, as well as the issue of reforms. Both yourself and President Ruto have been aligned. That being the case, what reforms do you really think should pave the way for giving Africa the resources that it needs to finance its own transformation and inclusive growth, even in the face of devastating climate change? What are the most critical reforms that you see and anticipate are needed?
Thank you. Let me quickly, first of all, and more importantly, thank our hosts, President Ruto, His Excellency, and also the President of the Africa Development Bank Group for inviting us here. Now, quickly to the point, we are talking about the architecture of, international financial architecture. Therefore, in mind, we have the architects. So what did the architect have in mind when they provided us with the architecture we have to deal with? They must have had their own interests. They must have framed things the way they wanted to benefit themselves, or maybe we can assume that they wanted to benefit the whole world. Now, we are here discussing the situation as it is, where we find there are enormous resources in this world, but inequitably distributed. So Africa has to look at itself and look at the whole world as it's set up. And we know in this world, people, countries, work for interests, their own interests. Africa's interests and the countries of our continent interests must be taken care of, beginning with ourselves. So, and we talk about speaking with one voice many times. It has to be one voice. It has also to be loud and clear and effective. For that to happen, we think about working together. We think about representation. And representation is not also just numbers. It's being able to speak out loudly and representing ourselves rather than having other people represent us. So it starts from what has been talked about, that is very important, whether it was in the speech of His Excellency President Ruto and His Excellency Musa Faki. Therefore, the reforms we are talking about is how do we disrupt, if you will, the current architecture as we have it. so that it includes significantly and visibly the interests of our continent. Our continent, whether it is human resources or natural resources or any resources we are thinking about, how can anyone interested in the well-being of the people of this world sideline our continent? In actual fact, if you look at the facts as they are, in a few decades, the only place in this world that will be having a growing middle class is Africa, the only one. So it is even in the interests of the rest of the world that has marginalized Africa to contribute to the well-being of our continent, because the growth of Africa, based on this middle class, feeds into the growth of the rest of the world. So they should even be accepting some of these proposals in self-interest, because Africa grows, the whole world grows. But Africa cannot wait to be handed this opportunity by anybody else. We therefore must be on the front line, really fighting for this right, and therefore for ourselves, but also which contributes to the well-being of the rest of the world.
President Kagame, I want to be a little bit provocative here. I've been coming to Kenya for probably 30 years, and there are places that I used to know that I no longer recognize. Why? Because the city's architects have changed the landscape. Now, most of the Bretton Woods institutions were created 60 to 80 years ago at a different time from the one that we live in. So, if we're going to talk about reform, it's not just the access to resources. It's looking at those institutions that were created back then and asking the question, are they still relevant to the needs of today? What is your thought about redesigning a lot of these institutions to make them fit for purpose?
Well, absolutely. It's a no-brainer that what worked 50 years ago or designed 50 years ago, things have changed, and therefore a rethink of a new design that fits the purpose must be into play. There's no question about it. But here what we are talking about is not simply an argument of whether, this is fit for purpose or this. I think everybody understands that point. But there are philosophies, if you will, or interests or that operate behind that. For us in Africa, we are hard-pressed to see that there is a change of these and in the design of these institutions. But maybe the way the institutions are set up, benefiting some parts of the world, those in those parts of the world are not interested in having the change happen, because it gives them control, it gives them say over other people's resources even. So it's not that people don't understand. Especially for Africa, we understand it better because of how we are affected. But the other parts of the world that have the power and control, it's also not because they don't understand, but it is because that it serves them very well, benefits them, that they are not interested or they are slow in allowing change to happen. So it's not a very complicated thing to understand. Everybody understands that. What is complicated is to reach this understanding and compromise that we don't lose anything by having everybody benefit as we should benefit, all of us. That's where the issue lies. And therefore, the reforms are based on this thinking. We are only looking for the pathways to having the reforms implemented that provide us with less costs than having to fight so much over what is obvious that actually benefits all of us, as I said.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. I'm going to come next to President Al-Menfi. Let me bring it closer home. Obviously, your country has had quite a number of challenges economically in recent times. What areas do you think that the African Development Bank can support Libya in the best to help you reach that last mile of reaching economic transformation in your country?
شكرا جزيلا. أنا أعطي فرصة حتى للترجمة إذا كان في. I will talk in Arabic.
And President Al-Menfi, if you could just move your microphone a little bit closer to you.
في البداية أحب أن أشكر فخامة الرئيس روتورو على الضيافة وحسن الاستقبال والشعب الكيني، وأيضا على مجهوده الكبير الذي يقوم به في هذا التحول الذي أعتبره هو نقلة مهمة جدا في التحول المالي وكيفية معالجة المؤسسات المالية في أفريقيا. والحقيقة أيضا أريد أن أؤكد على نقطة أخرى، وهو أن أحيانا في بعض الدول الأفريقية الحاجة تكون للعناصر الفنية وللخبرات وليس المالية، وهذا ما يسمى بالتوأمة وما يسمى بالتكامل المالي داخل أفريقيا، والذي نرجو أن يكون هو الطموح الذي نريد أن نصل عليه. كل المؤسسات المالية أسست في فترة كانت فيها الدول الأفريقية قابعة تحت الاستعمار، وبالتالي أسست وفق آليات معينة لا تخدم أفريقيا، لكن أفريقيا اليوم هي أفريقيا أكثر تطوراً، أفريقيا فيها العديد من الثروات من الموارد، وبالتالي قدرة أفريقيا اليوم على البناء والتنمية تختلف عن أي وقت ماضي. والحقيقة نحن نريد أن نؤكد على أن الدور الذي قامت به ليبيا في فترات زمنية في عدة دول أفريقية، مستعدة ليبيا اليوم أنها تدعم هذا الاستثمار الذي قامت به في دول أفريقية. يحتاج فقط إلى بعض الترتيبات المالية والضمانات المالية مع بعضنا كأفارقة. فليبيا مثال، ربما تكون ليبيا في استقرارها السياسي هي العنصر الذي سيساعد هذه المؤسسات المالية، وخصوصا أننا نتحدث الآن على 3 مؤسسات مالية مهمة جدا، والحديث فيها عن البنك الأفريقي للتنمية وكذلك البنك الأفريقي للاستثمار الذي يوجد الآن في طرابلس، ونحن بصدد يعني استكمال كل الإجراءات التنفيذية الخاصة به، وسيكون داعم في العديد من الدول الأفريقية، وربما هو سيكون إضافة حقيقية للاستقرار المالي في أفريقيا. نحن نريد أن يكون هناك أيضا تبادل ما بين، سواء كان بين الدول أو على مستوى الاتحاد الأفريقي داخل ليبيا في الاستيراد والتصدير، وهذا تحدث عليه فخامة الرئيس، والنسب اللي تحدثوا عليها، سواء كان التبادل داخل أوروبا أو آسيا. نحن في أفريقيا محتاجين أن يكون عندنا هذا الأمر. فليبيا هي بحاجة إلى تعاون أفريقي، لأن ليبيا هي دائما تنظر إلى بعدها الأفريقي. ليبيا تريد أن تستكمل كل ما بدأ تجاه أفريقيا، لأننا نحن نؤمن بأن قوة ليبيا هي من قوة أفريقيا، وقوة أفريقيا من قوة ليبيا، وبالتالي استثماراتنا عندما تتجه إلى الجنوب خصوصا
Kugangelwa Amadila. Kindly forgive me. I know that my pronunciation is not
New Superstay Skin Tint with vitamin C from Maybelline.